A man dies in Lochdu, and somehow everyone has an alibi. As Hamish Macbeth looks closer, he realizes the truth is hiding in plain sight. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed, while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. Hamish Macbeth stood just inside the Kirkhall door, trying to shake the worst of the rain from his coat. It clung anyway, making him look as if he had slept in a ditch. Lugs pressed against his leg, uneasy already. The dog never liked gatherings. Hamish didn't either, but the minister had hinted that it would look bad if the constable failed to appear. In Lochdu, appearances mattered more than sense. The hall felt close and damp. A borrowed mantel clock sat on a low table where the wall clock should have been. It ticked in a smug, uncertain way, as though it did not care whether it told the right time or not. Hamish eyed it with suspicion. A clock that looked pleased with itself was never a good sign. Roderick Sinclair, Rory, as folk muttered, stood at the front. He had been a skinny boy once, always boasting about the great things he would do. Now he looked like a different species altogether. Sleek hair, expensive shoes, a smile that tried to pass for friendly but was really measuring the room. The crofters sat stony-faced, arms folded. The fishers glared with the practised gloom of men used to being robbed by weather and strangers alike. Mrs. Patel fidgeted with a stack of papers that were probably accounts, though she hid them when Hamish came near. Rory launched into his speech without so much as a nod to the minister. "Holiday lodges," he said, as though announcing salvation. "New money for the village, unlocking value, tapping potential." His voice slid off the walls. Hamish felt himself shrink inside his damp coat. Then Rory spoke of buying up the old crofts by the loch. Callum Ross shifted, his boots scraping on the floor. "My father bled on that land," he muttered. Rory pretended not to hear, though the twitch at the corner of his mouth said otherwise. Hamish tried to keep things from sliding into a fight. "Folk here are not keen on sudden change," he said mildly. Rory gave him a bright, false smile. "Even your village bobby," Rory said, "can see we need progress." Laughter rippled. Not loud, not kind. Hamish felt the heat rising up his long neck. He wished he had stayed at the station with a cup of tea and Lugs snoring by the stove. Lugs gave a soft growl, picking up the strain in the room. Hamish nudged him aside with his foot. Tea was served afterwards. Weak stuff. Scones that tasted of old flour. People milled about, pretending to be civil. The borrowed clock ticked away, smug as ever. Mrs. Patel poured Hamish a cup and said, "He is not a man who goes away quietly." Hamish shrugged. "He'll bluster and go." It sounded more confident than he felt. Mrs. Patel raised an eyebrow. She had a way of making grown men feel like foolish boys. Lugs kept staring at Rory, ears tilted back. Hamish gave the dog another nudge. "Stop that!" Rory strode past them, nearly knocking over a plate of biscuits. "Busy night, constable," he said. "You should keep an eye on your village. Some of them live as though time has stopped." His smile was thin. When Rory left the hall, his coat barely got damp before he reached his car. Hamish watched him go with a faint dislike that he refused to examine. He had seen men like Rory before. City cleverness, country arrogance. They always acted as if everyone else should be grateful. Villagers collected their coats, muttering that they had better things to do than listen to that man. Yet Hamish heard them repeating his phrases under their breath. Unlocking value. Holiday lodges. Words that slipped into the air and stuck like burrs. Callum Ross brushed past Hamish, jaw clenched tight. "He'll choke on his own progress," he said softly. Hamish opened his mouth to tell him to be careful, but Callum was already out the door, the rain swallowing him. The minister's wife fussed with the mantel clock, tapping it as if it might suddenly behave. "It stopped earlier," she said. "I set it right. I think I set it right." Hamish did not reply. Folk in Lochtu had their own notions of time. Some stretched it, others hid inside it. That clock, ticking like a lyre, suited them well. As the last chairs scraped and the noise faded, Hamish felt a shift in the air. Not quite trouble, not yet. But the village had been poked, and Lochdu never forgot a poke. Gossip would start before the rain stopped. Stories would twist. Tempers would rise, all from one sleek man with shiny shoes and a mouth that smiled the wrong way. Hamish tugged at his collar, wishing it weren't sticking to his neck. He left the hall with Lugs close to his heel. The dog kept glancing back, uneasy. Hamish did not blame him. Nothing dramatic had happened. Not yet. But the ordinary grumbling of Lochdu had sharpened, taking on an edge he did not like. He should have paid more attention. He would regret that soon enough. The telephone would not stop rattling. It clattered in the cold little station office as if trying to knock itself off the table. Hamish, who had been dreaming of nothing at all, groaned and rolled towards it. Lugs was already up, pacing in a short circle, whining under his breath. The dog always knew before Hamish did that a day was going to start badly. Hamish picked up the receiver. Mr. Patel's voice came down the line in a nervous rush. "Constable, he has not collected the parcel. The man was very firm about the time. He said he would come first thing, but he has not come." Hamish rubbed his face. "Who has not come?" "Mr. Sinclair, and his hired car is still blocking the lane. My wife says something is wrong. She is very certain." Hamish stared at the receiver and wished he had gone for a different job in a different country. "It's early yet," he said, although he knew it was later than he wanted to be awake. "Folks sleep in on Sundays." "Not this man," Mr. Patel insisted. "Please go and look. The lane is blocked. If someone needs through—" Hamish muttered something that might have been agreement and put the receiver down. The room seemed colder than usual. He pulled on the same clothes he had taken off only hours ago, and they smelled faintly of last night's rain. Lugs watched him, head tilted as if judging the entire morning. "Come on then," Hamish said, though the dog needed no encouragement. Outside, Lochdu looked washed out and sullen. The sky was a dull grey that had no energy even for rain. The cold air had a metallic taste that Hamish disliked. It felt like chewing a spoon. He trudged down the lane with Lugs trotting beside him, sniffing the air in a way that suggested bad business. Rory Sinclair's hired car sat awkwardly across the narrow road, angled like a drunk trying to sit on a stool. Hamish frowned at it. "Stupid way to leave a car," he muttered. A good few villagers would have cursed it long before now. Strange none had knocked on the station door. He went down the small path to the rented cottage. It had the bleak, temporary feel of a place no one loved. Curtains still shut. No movement. Lugs growled low in his throat before Hamish even reached the door. "Stop that," Hamish said, though his own skin crawled a little. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked harder. Still nothing. "If he's sleeping like the dead," he said, and immediately regretted the phrase. He tried the handle. It gave way too easily. The door pushed inward with a soft scrape. Rory lay on the sitting-room floor as though he had been dropped there by an inattentive mover. One leg under him, one stretched out, head twisted at an angle that made Hamish's stomach twitch. A dark brown stain marked the hearthstone near the man's temple. A whiskey glass lay overturned nearby, and the bottle on the table was more than half full. The back door stood slightly open, the cold drifting in. Lugs whined again, louder this time. Hamish squatted, careful not to touch anything. The hearthstone was clean except for the blood. Too clean. And the whiskey bottle was upright, not knocked aside. He straightened up again quickly. His thoughts were short and unpleasant. He had told Mrs. Patel last night that Rory would bluster and go away. Well, he had not gone far. He stepped out to the lane and made the necessary call to Strathbane, wishing he could avoid it. Half the village must have sensed something already. Mrs. Patel appeared first, pulling her cardigan tightly around her. "You found him," she said, as if she had expected nothing else. Her face was pale. "I told my husband. I said something was wrong." "It may just be an accident," Hamish said without conviction. More folk drifted down the lane, but stopped short of the cottage. They stared in that quiet Highland way that pretended not to stare at all. Someone muttered that they had warned Rory not to upset the Crofters. Someone else hissed them to be quiet. Hamish wanted them all gone. Instead, Blair arrived. Blair's large bulk came spilling out of the Strathbane car before it had even stopped properly. Anderson followed, looking smug in a timid way. Blair surveyed the scene with a kind of greedy triumph. "Where is he, Macbeth? Inside?" He did not wait for an answer. Inside the cottage, Blair barely bent over the body. "Open and shut," he declared, wiping sweat from his forehead although it was cold. "Man got drunk, fell, cracked his skull. That'll do it." Blair waved the doctor's words aside as if they were an inconvenience rather than evidence Hamish kept his mouth shut. The back door, the odd angle of the body, the neat whiskey bottle, none of it fit a tidy story. But if Blair was happy in his ignorance, Hamish was not about to start dancing for him. The doctor from the larger village had arrived by then, a quiet man with no patience for Blair. He knelt by the body and frowned. "This bruising here," he said, touching Rory's neck, "that's not from a fall." Blair turned red. "Are ye saying what I think you're saying?" "Murder," the doctor said simply. The words sucked all warmth from the cottage. Outside, villagers whispered with fresh energy. Lochdu liked a scandal as much as it pretended to dislike one. Hamish's ears burned. He felt foolish for having dismissed Rory as nothing more than a loudmouth. Dead loudmouths were still dead. Mrs. Patel had edged nearer to the doorway. "All of us were at the Kirk Hall last night," she said loudly, as though rehearsing something. "Everyone. We saw him leave after the meeting. He was heading to the hotel for a drink." "That true, Macbeth?" Blair demanded. Hamish shrugged in a helpless way he did not quite feel. "I saw him leave, aye. After that, I canna say." Blair's eyes glittered. "So you're all each other's alibis, are you?" he said, loud enough for those outside to hear. The villagers stiffened but kept their mouths politely shut. Hamish crouched again, looking at Rory's wrist. The watch had stopped at 9:30. When he lifted it slightly, a smear of peat on Rory's trouser hem caught his eye. Hamish frowned. It did not match the clean floor around them, nor the neat little path outside. Blair noticed Hamish's interest and puffed himself up. "Don't touch anything, Macbeth. We'll handle this." Hamish stood. "You'll make a mess of it." Blair stepped close enough for Hamish to smell cheap aftershave. "Say that again." Hamish said nothing. He was not in the mood to be thrown across a room. Anderson shuffled near the back door. "Looks like it's been open a while," he said. "Cold in here." Blair dismissed him. "Open door means nothing. Folk forget to latch things." Hamish doubted Rory forgot anything. The man had been too pleased with himself to be careless. The lane had filled further. Tourists from the hotel had wandered down, pretending to be out for a morning stroll. A couple of fishers stood with their arms folded, looking as if they were guarding a crime scene rather than gawking at it. Mrs. Patel wrung her hands, which was unlike her. She usually kept herself tidy. "Constable," she said again, "we were all in the hall last night. You remember that, all of us." Hamish nodded, though her tone pricked at him. Her insistence felt too firm, as if the whole village had already agreed on what they had seen or had not seen. Blair came out of the cottage and announced loudly that Strathbane would take charge. "We don't need amateurs messing up the evidence," he said, glaring at Hamish. "You can keep the gawkers back." Hamish had to "He joined us for a drink," the woman said. "Lovely man. Very modern." "Left before 9, the husband added. "Yes, definitely before 9. Hamish nodded politely. "How are you sure of the time?" "Oh," the man said, blinking. "The clock above the bar." "That clock's been slow for years," Morag called out from across the room. "You need to wind it, and I forget." The tourists looked uncertain. "Perhaps it was earlier then," the husband said. "Or later." Blair scowled from the doorway. "Get them out, Macbeth. They're useless." "Everyone's useless to you," Hamish muttered, but only to himself. In the far corner, Mrs. Patel's teenage son stood with his hands shoved in his pockets. He looked as if he wanted to be anywhere else. "You saw him last night?" Hamish asked quietly. The boy nodded, posting a letter, just when the rain started again. "When was that?" He shrugged. "Dunno, after the meeting, before we went home." Hamish wrote it down, a letter posted. Another time no one could pin down. The rain had come and gone in miserable patches all evening. It wasn't much of a marker. Lugs shifted under the bench, ears flicking whenever someone raised their voice. He looked like he wanted to leave. Hamish agreed with him. Blair marched back in. "Well, any suspects? Any confessions?" "Folk were in the hall," Hamish said. "All night, it seems." Blair snorted. "All covering for each other, you mean? Highland solidarity. Sick of it." Hamish felt the sting of that, though Blair wasn't clever enough to make it hurt properly. "Maybe someone from outside followed him," Hamish said. "A business enemy. He made folk angry." Blair's eyes lit with ridicule. "Organised crime, is it? Will I expect gangsters out of Glasgow next? Fool idea, Macbeth." But he wrote it down anyway, no doubt imagining himself bragging to Daviot later. Hamish felt tired. The villagers were repeating each other without even meaning to. "I was at the hall." "We were all there." The same words, rolling from mouth to mouth. Not nervousness, something else. But Hamish was too weary to chase it. He walked along the tables one more time, trying to catch any slip. There were none. Too neat, too smooth, too similar. Loch Dhu had never been so tidy in its stories. Mrs. Patel approached as he gathered the papers. "You will tell Blair we were all there," she said. "I'll tell him what you said," Hamish replied. She frowned. No need to make it sound doubtful. Hamish shrugged. She walked away with a stiff back, offended or anxious or both. When he stepped outside, the rain had started again, soft and thin. Villagers drifted away in clumps, whispering. Lugs pressed against his knee, uneasy. Hamish looked back at the Kirk Hall. The borrowed clock ticked loudly through the open door, still pleased with itself, though Hamish doubted it had given the right time once in its life. He felt something shifting, but not fast enough for him to grasp. Too many people agreeing, too many stories polished clean. "Loch Dhu's never this sure about anything," he muttered. Lugs gave a small whine. Hamish started down the road, already dreading Blair's next demand. He should have paid more attention. He always thought that after the fact. And the fact was this: a murdered man and a village suddenly speaking with one voice. It was never a good sign. Blair had already made a mess of Hamish's little station before Hamish even stepped through the door. That was the first thing wrong. Papers were scattered everywhere, as if a high wind had blown through Strathbane and deposited its rubbish in Loch Dhu. Blair stood in the middle of it all, flushed and sweating despite the cold. "Macbeth!" he shouted, waving a sheet as though it were a royal decree. "Get in here. I've cracked it." Hamish shut the door behind him. Lugg slunk in after, nose low, picking up the thick stink of Blair's excitement. Hamish wished he had left the dog at home. "What have ye cracked, then?" he asked, keeping his tone mild. "Your crofter," Blair said. "Callum Ross. Behind on his rent. Months and months. Our dear victim," he stabbed the paper triumphantly. "Sent him eviction notice. That's motive. Right there. Open and shut." Hamish felt a dull surprise. He had taken Callum for sullen and stubborn like half the village, but not violent. "Folk struggle with rent all the time," he said. "Doesn't make him a killer." Blair ignored that. He argued with the man at the meeting. Several heard it. Anderson's been taking statements, threats and shouting, clear as day. Blair puffed out his chest. "He kills Rory in a temper, drags him to the hearth to make it look like a fool, then trots off to tend his precious sheep." Hamish looked at Anderson, who looked back with his usual slippery grin. The man always smirked when he thought he was on the winning team. Hamish swallowed his irritation. "Where is Callum now?" "In there," Blair said, nodding toward the tiny interview room as if it were a grand interrogation chamber, waiting to confess. Hamish doubted Callum would confess to stealing a biscuit, but Blair had already yanked the door open and strode inside, forcing Hamish to follow. Callum sat rigid at the little table, jaw clenched, cap on his knee. He looked more tired than dangerous. Blair slapped the report down in front of him. "You were behind on the rent," Blair announced, "and Sinclair gave you notice. That's motive." Callum didn't flinch. "Plenty in this village are behind on something," he said quietly. "Folk don't go murdering every man who annoys them." Blair leaned in. "You threatened him in the hall. Folk heard you." Callum's face went white, but his voice stayed steady. "Everyone threatens men like that. He was a meddler." Hamish shifted uncomfortably. Blair's eyes narrowed. "Macbeth here saw you leave the hall in a right temper, didn't you, Macbeth?" Hamish hesitated. He had seen Callum leaving, looking grim, but grim was not wild. "He looked annoyed," Hamish said. "Folk were annoyed." Blair pounced on it. "There ye are, corroboration." He turned to Anderson. "Get the cuffs." "That's not necessary," Hamish said, feeling heat crawl up his neck. "We've barely begun." Blair rounded on him. "You contradict me in front of a suspect again and I'll have your badge, Macbeth. This is my case." Hamish shut his mouth. It tasted like failure. Callum rose slowly when Anderson prodded him. "This is foolishness," Callum said. "I was in my fields the whole time." "No witnesses to that," Blair replied with satisfaction. "Typical." As the door banged behind them, Hamish stood alone in the tiny room with Lugs pressing close to his leg. The dog gave a soft whine, as if scolding him for saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Outside the station, villagers had already gathered, pretending to loiter. They parted just enough to let the officers through, but their eyes were sharp and hungry for news. The moment they saw Callum in handcuffs, a ripple went through them. Mrs. Patel pushed forward. "Hamish Macbeth, what are you doing?" she demanded. "You know Callum. He has no cleverness for murder." "It's just questioning," Hamish murmured, but her glare burned hotter than Blair's ever had. "Your silence condemned him," she snapped. "You should have spoken." Hamish felt himself shrinking inside his coat. "Blair would arrest a sheep if it walked past him the wrong way," he muttered. "That's no excuse," she said, turning away sharply. Others whispered as he passed. Hamish should have stopped it. He lets Blair do as he likes. He's always protecting the wrong folk. Every word seemed to stick to his boots like mud. He escaped toward the loch to breathe air that wasn't filled with accusation. Lugs followed, tail low. The water sat flat and grey, offering no comfort. Hamish stared at it until the cold got into his bones. By late afternoon, he forced himself to visit the Kirk Hall again. The minister's wife was fussing with the borrowed clock. She gave him a thin smile. "It kept stopping last night," she said. "Twice I had to wind it. Such a nuisance." "Stopping?" Hamish asked. "Yes, I thought it was the damp. Wouldn't keep time. Never does what it should." Hamish nodded, filing the comment away. A clock that couldn't keep time was a poor anchor for any alibi. Still, he said nothing. His mind clung stubbornly to Blair's theory, if only because it allowed him to stop thinking for a moment. He walked back to the station in a sour mood, lugs padding close enough that their steps nearly touched. The village lights flickered on one by one, as if Loch Dhu were ashamed of the dark. Hamish knew he had made a mistake. He had let Blair run wild. He had given him just enough to justify it. And now the whole village smelled the weakness on him. He wished, not for the first time, that the world would quiet itself for 5 minutes so he could think straight. But Loch Dhu never did what he wished. Later that morning, Hamish pushed open the door to Patel's shop, and the bell gave an irritated jangle, as if it disapproved of him. Something was already wrong. The shop was too full, too loud, and everyone inside was speaking with the falsely bright voices of people determined not to mention murder. Lugs padded in beside him, sat by the door, and laid his head on his paws, ears twitching at every sharp word. Mrs. Patel stood behind the counter, lips pinched. She was serving tea bags to one crofter, matches to another, and pretending not to hear the two fishers arguing about which of them owed the other a pound. All of it was noise meant to hide the real thing they wanted to talk about. Hamish tried to look official. "Just checking on folk," he said, though nobody had asked. Alec Murray, sorting through a pile of stale buns, didn't look up. "Checking on us, or checking on how fast Blair's dragging Callum off to the electric chair?" "There is no electric chair in Scotland," Hamish said. Alec shrugged. "Aye, well, Blair'll invent one if it gives him a headline." Mrs. Patel snapped, "Mind your manners in my shop." Alec gave her a mock bow, then wandered off to pick up a tin he had no intention of buying. The crofters murmured among themselves. Hamish could feel the village tightening like a bad stitch. He cleared his throat. "Did Rory come in here much?" Mrs. Patel answered too quickly. "He bought bread, envelopes, the usual." One crofter snorted. "He used this place as his office, Hamish. Everyone saw him hounding Mr. Patel for papers." Mrs. Patel glared at the man. "He asked for rent books. Nothing more. Anyone would do the same." "Anyone planning to throw half the village off their land?" the crofter muttered. That set off a small explosion of talking. Fishers, crofters and tourists all pretending to shop while arguing about Rory's plans. Mrs. Patel banged the till shut as if the noise might stop. Hamish hated scenes like this. "I only need to know whether he was here last night," he said. "That's all." Mrs. Patel hesitated. A tiny flicker. "I don't remember." Her husband appeared from the storeroom carrying a crate of biscuits. He set it down, wiped his hands, then leaned close to Hamish. "I kept notes," he whispered, "for my own protection." Before Mrs. Patel could object, he produced a small notebook from his apron pocket. He flipped through it with the pride of a man who'd been waiting for someone to ask. "Here, 8:40. He bought envelopes and a phone card." Hamish blinked. 8:40? That contradicted the tourist's story entirely. Mr. Patel nodded. "I wrote it at the time. He wanted exact charges for everything. Never trusted anyone." From across the shop, one crofter called out, "You Patels were in too deep with that man." Mrs. Patel straightened like a pulled string. "We sell goods. That is all." Callum's wife chose that moment to enter the shop, She looked as if she had aged a year since morning. "You knew," she said to Mrs. Patel. "You knew he was planning to throw us off." Mrs. Patel's face flushed. "I did not. I sell bread. I don't run the Highlands." Hamish stepped forward. "Let's keep calm." Alec barked a laugh. "Calm? You're quick enough to drag Callum away, but can't be bothered to ask why Rory spent half his time whispering in here." Hamish stiffened. "I didn't drag anyone." Alec Priscilla. Hamish. The Kirk Hall already felt wrong the moment Hamish stepped inside. Folk were standing too straight, speaking too politely, as if good posture and forced sweetness could hide something rotten underneath. The air smelled of floor polish and damp wool, a combination that made his nose itch. Luggs slid under a chair, stretched out, then lifted his head again as soon as someone cleared their throat. He did not trust the mood in the room, and Hamish couldn't blame him. "We'll begin," said the minister, though nobody had asked him to. He sounded hopeful, the way a man sounds when he knows disaster is coming but tries to pretend otherwise. "The Saley must be rescheduled. It reflects poorly on the Kirk to postpone such things." "It was never a Saley," Hamish said mildly. "It was a meeting with tea." An uncomfortable shuffle ran through the committee. Mrs. Patel folded her hands primly. Alec the fisherman tugged at his collar like it was choking him. Two of the Crofter women exchanged a look that said Hamish was being rude but also correct. "We intended a Cayley," the minister's wife insisted. "We had prepared the hall." Hamish glanced at the borrowed mantel clock on its little table. It sat there ticking smugly, as if it enjoyed being wrong. "Aye," he said. "About the hall. I'd like to go over the timing again. Who was here and when?" That produced the exact reaction he expected. Tight smiles, stiff backs, and the faint whisper of someone's shoe squeaking on the polished floor. Mrs. McPhee spoke up first. "We were here preparing tables from 7 onward. We served tea at 8. We listened to Rory's dreadful speech. Then we cleaned up. We were all here till 9:30 at least." The others nodded so eagerly they looked like a flock of chickens craning for feed. Hamish kept his tone pleasant. "And how did you know it was 9:30? Silence fell like a dropped stone. Alec scratched his neck, pretending he had an itch so fierce it required full concentration. The minister's wife twisted her wedding ring. Mrs. Patel studied a mark on the table as if it were a rare insect. Finally the minister's wife sighed. The clock stopped. Twice. "I guessed the time when I reset it." "Guessed," Hamish repeated. "And did the rest of ye know she guessed?" More silence. Someone coughed. Alec sniffed loudly, pretending it was nothing. Hamish leaned back in his chair. "So it might not have been 9:30. Mrs. Patel bristled. "We were here," she said sharply. "We were all here." Hamish kept his face blank. "All of you? The whole time?" Alec suddenly found his shoes very interesting. "I slipped out for a smoke," he muttered. "Maybe 10 minutes or 20. Hard to say. The rain was coming in sideways. Could have been longer." "Anyone else slip out?" Hamish asked. A Crofter woman cleared her throat. "I popped home to check on my mother. She gets nervous in storms." "It wasn't storming," Alec muttered. "She gets nervous in storms," the Crofter repeated, eyes narrowing. Luggs lifted his head and gave a small, uneasy whine. The sound made several people jump. Hamish decided to push the knife in gently. So folk left, came back, wandered out, wandered in, and no one really kept track of the time. Mrs. Patel's mouth tightened. "We were here," she insisted again, but the certainty was gone. Her words sounded thin as tissue paper. Hamish nodded. "Aye, maybe, but none of you can tell me the hour for sure." The committee sat like children waiting for scolding. Even the minister looked as if he wished he could hide behind a hymn book. Hamish stood. This was no Saley. It was a meeting folk fled from as soon as they could, and if someone slipped away to see Rory, none of you would have noticed. A murmur of protest rose, small and nervous. The minister's wife pressed a hand to her forehead. Alec muttered something dark under his breath. Mrs. Patel closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with a glare meant to hide her embarrassment. "We are not liars," she said stiffly. "I never said you were," Hamish replied. "Folk misremember things, especially when they all want to remember the same thing." No one answered that. The committee, so proud a few minutes earlier, now looked as if they wished the earth would open and swallow the Kirk Hall whole. The minister tried to rescue the moment. "Perhaps," he said weakly, "we should focus on rescheduling." But nobody cared about the Saley anymore. They rose one by one, eager to escape. Chairs scraped the polished floor, coats were grabbed. Avoiding Hamish's gaze became a sport. Even the minister gave him a weary smile that carried the message, "Why must you make things difficult?" Lugg stood, tail tucked slightly, picking up the sour shame that clung to everyone. As they filed past him, Mrs. Patel paused. "We were here," she whispered, as if saying it softly would make it more believable. Hamish simply nodded. He had no desire to rub salt into a wound, but he could feel the irritation radiating from her, and from the others, as if he had personally insulted the entire Kirk. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, the hall felt too large and too empty. The mantel clock gave a smug tick as though proud of the chaos it had caused. Hamish looked down at Luggs. "Some Cayley, that." Luggs gave a soft, exhausted whine. The respectable front the village had tried to put up had cracked clean through. Now Hamish had a wider suspect list, a more tangled set of lies, and a Kirk committee angry enough to sabotage him the next chance they got. He switched off the hall lights and stepped into the cold air, feeling the weight of the half-truth still hanging in the room. Nothing in Lochdu was tidy anymore. Hamish knew the day was going wrong the moment Mr. Ross, who normally guarded her counter like a terrier with a bone and said, with far too much relish, "There's a glamorous city woman asking for ye at the hotel. Says it's important." Nothing good ever followed the words glamorous and important in Lochdu. Luggs trotted beside him, ears twitching at the heightened gossip in the air, the way dogs can sense that humans are about to behave stupidly. Hamish made his way to Tommel Castle Hotel with a sinking heart. The place always made him feel shabby. Too much velvet, too much carpet, too much polished brass. He stepped inside and spotted Priscilla at once, standing like the very picture of restraint near the lounge door. "You took your time," she said, not unkindly, but with that cool tone that made him feel 17 again. "I was busy," Hamish muttered. "So is she." Priscilla gave a tiny nod toward the private lounge. Lydia Fraser, from Glasgow, or London, or whatever she wants people to think. She knew Rory. Quite well, I gather. Hamish stiffened. "Why did you arrange this?" "Because you weren't doing it," Priscilla said, and Blair interviewing a woman like her would end with him drooling into her handbag. Hamish opened his mouth to argue, but she had already turned away. He could never win an argument with her. She changed direction like a startled deer. He stepped into the lounge. The woman waiting for him looked as if she had stepped off a glossy magazine cover. Expensive coat, perfect hair, shoes that probably cost more than his annual pay rise, if he had ever accepted one. Lydia Fraser sat with one leg crossed over the other, tapping a manicured nail on the side of her teacup. "You're the constable," she said, not rising. "Took you long enough." Hamish resisted the urge to check his boots for mud. "Hamish Macbeth," he said, "Lochdu Police." "Charming," she said, though she did not sound charmed. "Shall we get this over with?" Luggs slunk in behind him and lay near the door, head flat on the carpet but eyes open. He did not trust her perfume. "I understand you knew Mr. Sinclair," Hamish said. She gave a careless shrug. "He was advising me on investments." "What kind?" "The kind that make money," she said, with the weary amusement of someone forced to explain the obvious to a simpleton. "He had contacts, opportunities. He was very knowledgeable." Hamish felt a flicker of mean thought, knowledgeable enough to get himself killed, but kept his face blank. "Where were ye the night he died?" She sipped her tea. "With him for a while. We had a drink in the bar, until about 9. Then he said he had figures to check and left, alone." "That's it?" "That's it," she said. "The landlady will confirm it. Rory paid." Hamish nodded slowly. He could smell something faint on her coat. Not the sharp tang of cheap whiskey Rory bought at Patel's. Something richer. The hotel brand, if he had to guess. He glanced at her handbag, bulging in a strange lopsided way. "Did ye ever visit his cottage?" he asked. She laughed, a precise tinkling sound that sounded rehearsed. "Down those muddy tracks? In these shoes?" She lifted one foot to display a delicate heel. "Don't be absurd," he flushed, annoyed that she had made him feel provincial. "Folk do stranger things." "Not me," she said. "I don't step into mud for men or police officers." Voices drifted from the corridor, the landlady's slow drawl and Priscilla's cooler tone. Lydia's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Hamish. Luggs suddenly lifted his head and growled quietly when Lydia reached to pat him. She pulled back at once. Unfriendly creature. Hamish shrugged. He's usually a good judge. It was bravado, and she knew it. She gave him a small smile that said she was amused by his attempt at authority. Hamish pressed on. You say 9 o'clock. How do you know? She shrugged. The bar clock. And I don't make a habit of staying out late in places like this. The bar clock was famous for being slow, but Hamish let it slide. Too many people were already claiming about 9, and he was too worn down to reopen the argument. Blair would love this tidy timeline. Is that all? Lydia asked, already rising. For now, Hamish said. She walked past him, her perfume drifting behind her like a challenge. Priscilla stepped out from the corridor as Lydia swept away. Well? Priscilla asked. Hamish glared. I didn't ask for your help. You need help, she said simply. He bristled like a schoolboy scolded for untidy handwriting. Blair'll love her story. It fits his nonsense perfectly. And does it fit yours? She asked. I don't have a story, Hamish snapped. That much is obvious, she said, and left him standing there like a fool. The landlady appeared next. She was with Rory, she said before he could ask. Paid for the drinks, he did. Left before 9, that's all I know. Hamish thanked her, though he doubted the usefulness of any of it. The whole village seemed to be conspiring to compress every event into the vague window between 8 and 9, as if time itself had grown embarrassed. Outside, Lugs bumped into his leg, picking up the tension between him and Priscilla, between him and everyone, really. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. We're not getting anywhere, boy. Lugs gave a soft huff. Blair would seize Lydia's neat alibi and use it to hammer Callum further, and Hamish, too bogged down in village politics and his own irritation, had failed to challenge anything properly. He stood in the cold air outside the hotel, watching Lydia's silhouette glide past the windows. Something about her felt wrong, too polished, too rehearsed. But Blair didn't want polished. He wanted easy, and Hamish had just handed him easy on a silver plate. Lugs pressed close. Hamish stared down the road, feeling the whole case slipping further out of reach. Nothing was settled. Everything was getting worse. The rain had started hammering the station roof long before Hamish realised how late it was. Something was already wrong. The kitchen table was buried under scraps of paper with time scribbled on them, and none of the cursed things matched. The Kirkhalls' borrowed clock, the hotel bar clock, Mr. Patel's neat little notebook, Rory's wristwatch stuck at 9:30 as if it had decided that was a good place to stop living. Every one of them told a different story. Hamish rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand. The skin felt gritty, as though rainwater and worry had mixed into mud. Lugs lay by the stove in an uneasy sleep, paws twitching, tail jerking, as if chasing something he could never quite catch. Even the dog was troubled. Hamish trailing only because he had no choice. The bell jingled weakly as Blair shoved the door open. The shop fell silent. Mrs. Patel stiffened behind the counter. A small crowd of villagers lingered between shelves, pretending to examine tins they had been pretending to examine all week. News had travelled faster than rain down a drainpipe. Blair held the memo up like a banner. "Attention, everyone! Chief Superintendent Daviot has instructed that Constable Macbeth here," he jabbed a thumb at Hamish, "step back and leave the investigation to Strathbane. Sheep and speeding tourists are more his line." A few villagers looked shocked. More looked satisfied. Mrs. Patel's expression froze into polite ice. Hamish felt his ears burn. Lugs let out a sharp growl. Blair made a lazy kick in the dog's direction, not quite connecting but close enough to earn a murderous glare from Hamish. "Don't antagonize the animal," Blair said with false concern. "Could be dangerous when confused, bit like its owner." Hamish's hands twitched. If he struck a superior officer, he'd be transferred to some god-forsaken outpost by nightfall. Blair knew it. The villagers knew it. Priscilla, who had just entered quietly behind them, definitely knew it. Blair sauntered out, Anderson trailing like a badly trained duckling. The shop remained silent. Then Callum Ross's wife, who had been pretending to read a newspaper, folded it with careful disdain and walked straight past Hamish without meeting his eye. Mrs. Patel served Hamish last, after everyone else, and slid his change across the counter as if it might burn her fingers. "You handed him everything he needed," she said quietly. Hamish opened his mouth to defend himself, but she had already turned to serve the next customer. Outside, more villagers avoided him. Even the minister, passing on his bicycle, gave a stiff nod and no more. Later that morning at the kirk, Hamish slipped into the back pew. The minister had chosen a sermon about truth, responsibility, and the importance of honouring one's duties. Nobody looked at Hamish, which meant everyone was thinking of him. When he stepped outside, eyes slid away from his. Only Lugs came close, pressing against his leg with quiet loyalty. At the hotel, Priscilla waited for him near the doors, arms loosely folded, expression unreadable. "Well," she said, "you gave them exactly what they needed." Hamish bristled. "Maybe I'm glad to be rid of it." She gave him a cool, flat look that stripped the lie bare. "No, you're not." He turned away. "Enjoy your stay," he said, unnecessarily rude, anything to escape her accuracy. Back at the station, Blair and Anderson were still rummaging through drawers as if evidence might fall out of them by accident. Anderson held a small card in his hand. "This came from the electricity board," Anderson said. "Meter reading at Rory's cottage shows usage well past 10 o'clock that night." Hamish snapped his head up. "Past 10? Aye." Anderson shrugged. "Could be a clerk's mistake. Blair says ignore it." Blair waved a hand without turning. "Meters get misread. Irrelevant." "It's not irrelevant," Hamish said. Blair turned then, grinning like a man pleased to have a target. "You are assistants only, Macbeth. Remember your place." Hamish's fists tightened. "It changes the time of death." "It changes nothing," Blair said, "unless you want disciplinary action for interfering." Anderson smirked, emboldened by safety in numbers. Hamish bit down on his temper and returned to the kitchen. The peat fire spat sparks as if sharing his mood. He sank into a chair. Lugs climbed up beside him and rested his heavy head on Hamish's lap, sensing the churn inside him. Hamish stared into the fire. "Power used after 10, he murmured. So he was alive, or someone was. But he was muzzled now. Strathbane had taken the reins, and Lochdu had turned its back on him for letting it happen. Lugs whined softly. "Don't you start," Hamish muttered, though the dog understood nothing except that his master was hurting. Outside, the rain started again, hard enough to blur the windows. The sound filled the little station like an accusation. Hamish sat still, uneasy, unresolved, knowing the consequences of his mistake were only beginning. Hamish knew something was wrong the moment he realised he'd been staring at the same cold cup of tea for 15 minutes. The peat fire spat weakly, giving off more complaint than warmth. Lugs paced near the door, nails ticking on the floorboards, shooting Hamish looks that were half plea, half reprimand. The dog never paced unless the air in the station felt tight. "All right, then," Hamish muttered. "We'll walk. It's for your sake, not mine." It was a lie, and even the dog knew it. The wind had teeth. It bit at Hamish's ears and pushed his lanky frame sideways as they made their way toward the loch. The water looked like a sheet of dull metal, lifeless and sulking. The shoreline mud sucked at Hamish's boots. Lugs kept tugging ahead, whining softly in his throat. "You're too restless today," Hamish grumbled. "Dog should have been born a warrior." But Lugs stopped suddenly, nose pointed toward a stretch of track near Rory's cottage. His hackles rose, not in alarm exactly, but alertness. Hamish followed the dog's gaze and saw what had pulled him. Tyre tracks, fresh and deep in the mud. They weren't from Rory's hired car. He could tell by the spacing and the tread. Hamish crouched, running a hand along the edge of one print. "Someone else drove here," he murmured, "and not long ago." Lugs trotted further down the track toward the small, seldom-used jetty. Hamish sighed but followed. The planks creaked like old bones. At the edge, caught on a post, lay a frayed length of mooring rope, damp and recently pulled taut. Beside it, more scuff marks, too many and too new to be natural wear. "Somebody came by boat," Hamish said. The words felt heavy. The tidy timeline he had forced on the case cracked at once. A boat meant the killer had not walked from Lochdu at all. A boat meant someone could have come long after the villagers had scattered home. He straightened, feeling a cold knot forming in his chest. Damn. As he and Lugs made their way back toward the village, the dog kept glancing at him, sensing Hamish's mind racing. The wind whipped their faces, pushing them faster up the track. Near the main road, Alec the fisherman appeared, carrying a coil of netting and smelling faintly of diesel. "Out in this weather?" he drawled. "You're mad." Hamish nodded at the netting. "You were out last night, then?" Alex shrugged, too casually. Engine choked in the rain. Came in early. Hamish didn't like the tone. How early? Alex's eyes narrowed. Why? You think I railed across to kill the man? Is that it? You accusing me now that your friend Blair's got his man? The word friend held enough scorn to fell a tree. Folk had begun to gather. Mrs. McPhee, old Mr. Grant, 2 tourists pretending not to eavesdrop. Lochdu loved a street argument. Alex stepped closer, chest puffed. You're desperate now, aren't you, Hamish? Desperate because you let Blair take your job. Hamish felt his ears burn again. I'm asking a simple question. Then you can ask it somewhere else, Alex snapped. I'm not giving you more gossip to twist. He pushed past, muttering something about fools and dogs. Several villagers watched Hamish openly as he walked away. Their expressions were a mix of pity and suspicion, a combination he despised. At the station, Blair was waiting. The door had barely swung shut before Blair was roaring. You've been snooping! After I told you this case is Strathbane's! Hamish stopped just inside the doorway, coat dripping, lugs pressed against his leg, tense. I was walking the dog, Hamish said evenly. Blair's face went purple. Walking the... Daviot will hear about this. You're trying to undermine my case, Macbeth. Undermine me. Anderson snickered from the corner. He thinks he's still in charge. Blair jabbed a finger toward Hamish. One more stunt like this, and I'll recommend shutting this whole useless station. Let's see how you like living under someone else's roof down in Strathbane, where you belong. Hamish stared at him. I belong here. Not for long, Blair said, smug again. He swept out, Anderson scuttling after him. When their footsteps faded, Hamish finally let himself breathe. Lugs padded into the kitchen, curled beneath the table, and lay with his eyes open, watching every move Hamish made. Hamish took out the frayed mooring rope, the small scrap of mud from the tyre, and his notes on the electricity meter reading. He spread them on the table. Together they painted a picture Blair refused to see. Someone had visited Rory well after the village's tidy alibis ended. Someone with a boat. Someone who didn't need to walk through Lochdu at all. Hamish sat heavily, rubbing Lugs's ear with his boot. They think I'm a fool, he said. Lugs did not blink. Hamish stared at the rope again. No warmth came from the fire, only a low crackle, sharp enough to sound like warning. He wasn't supposed to investigate anymore, but the truth was starting to creep in anyway, like damp through stone. Hamish knew something was wrong the moment he stepped out of the station that morning and saw 3 villagers staring at him and then quickly looking away. People only avoided his eyes when Blair had been spreading news. Lug sensed the tension too. He pressed close to Hamish's leg, tail held low in wary sympathy. By the time Hamish reached Patel's shop, he heard it outright. Old Mr. Grant, who never whispered anything in his life, murmured to Mrs. Ross, "They broke him in Strathbane, so they did." Mrs. Ross nodded grimly, as if she'd known all along Callum would crumble. She looked up only when she saw Hamish. Her mouth tightened. Hamish felt a lurch of anger and dread. "What's this?" "Ask your own folk," Mrs. Ross said sharply. "You sent him there." Before Hamish could answer, Blair himself swaggered into view, Anderson scampering behind him like a badly trained terrier. Blair looked so pleased with himself, he might have been preparing for a parade. "There ye are, Macbeth," Blair called. "Thought you'd like the good news." Hamish did not trust Blair's idea of good news. "What is it now?" "Callum Ross confessed," Blair said, slow and triumphant. "Told us he confronted Sinclair at the cottage. Wild temper, he said. Gave him a shove. Man tripped, cracked his skull. Manslaughter. Tidy as you like." A ripple ran through the street. Some gasped. Others exhaled as though grateful someone, anyone, had finally said something definite. Blair basked in the attention. Hamish felt heat rise behind his ears. "Callum confessed? To you?" "Aye," Blair said smugly. "And Daviot's fair delighted. Press will get their story. Rural tragedy, swift justice. Just what the Highlands need. Order." Hamish didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to. Blair clapped him on the shoulder as though they were friends. "You're needed at Strathbane. Formal witness to the statement. Don't dawdle." Hamish wanted to shove the hand away. He didn't. At Strathbane headquarters, the stale corridors smelled of despair and cheap disinfectant. Callum sat at the interview table, pale, hollow-cheeked, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He looked as though someone had wrung him out. Blair stood beside him, arms folded, the picture of smug authority. "Right, Callum. Tell Constable Macbeth what you told us." Callum lifted deadened eyes toward Hamish. His voice came out flat, emptied. "I confronted Rory, at the cottage. I was wild. I grabbed him. He tripped and fell. That's that." Hamish thought of the bruising on Rory's neck, marks no fool could make, and felt the lie settle into the room. Hamish stared at him. This wasn't a story. It was a script. "Why didn't you say that at the start?" Callum's gaze flickered away. What difference would it make? Hamish felt the words like a stone to the chest. Callum wasn't even pretending to believe what he'd said. He was done fighting, done thinking, done hoping. Blair didn't notice, or pretended not to. "Sign here," he instructed. Callum signed. It felt less like truth and more like surrender. Hamish signed as witness. On the walk out, Blair crowed to Anderson. "Case closed. Will be in the papers. Mark me." Hamish, the air tasted unsettled, as though the village itself knew the truth was scraping close. Hamish knew something was wrong the moment he walked into Tommel Castle's bar. The fire was burning too brightly, the tourists were too quiet, and Priscilla sat at a corner table with her smooth hands wrapped around a glass as if she owned the place. Beside her lounged a man Hamish had never seen before. Slick hair, sharp jacket, the sort who used aftershave as personality. Lug slunk behind Hamish's legs, ears twitching. The dog disliked the man on sight. Hamish felt much the same. "Hamish," Priscilla said, her voice level. "This is Colin." Colin rose as though stepping onto a stage. "Constable Macbeth. I've heard quite a bit about Loch Dew." "Fascinating case you have." Hamish didn't sit. "I told you," he said to Priscilla, "I don't need interference." Colin blinked, then smiled too broadly. Just a quiet drink, friendly conversation. But he already had a notebook out. Hamish saw the faint dent of a pen mark on the page where he'd been writing before they arrived. "What happened to quiet?" Hamish muttered. Priscilla lifted a cool eyebrow. "You weren't doing anything except sulk in that station." Hamish felt heat crawl up his neck. "It's police business." "Someone should remind you of that," she replied softly. But the softness wasn't kindness, it was distance. Colin, sensing the tension as neatly as a crow senses scraps, slipped away and began chatting up hotel guests. Hamish watched the man lean in toward a pair of crofters at the bar. In minutes, whispers began. Press. Crofter railroading. Confession forced. His name floated through the air like cold smoke. Hamish felt sick. Blair arrived before the hour was out. He burst into the bar, face already red with the fury he'd been storing up. "Macbeth," he bellowed, "what filth are ye feeding the papers?" "I've fed them nothing," Hamish said. His voice sounded thin even to himself. "Davitt says a journalist is sniffing about, asking whether the police bullied a confession." Blair jabbed a finger toward the tables. "You've done this." Colin, pretending innocence, raised his glass. "I didn't invite him," Hamish said. Priscilla spoke then, quiet but precise. "I did." Blair rounded on her with a sharp laugh. "Oh, splendid. The lady thought she'd meddle in police work." He turned back to Hamish. "You're a disgrace. A lazy, meddling Highland peasant who should never have been given a badge." The insult echoed across the bar. Several villagers glanced down, embarrassed for him, or perhaps relieved it wasn't their turn. Lugs growled, low and steady. Hamish rested a hand on the dog's neck, more for his own sake than the dog's. "Blair," he said, "you're out of order." "And you're out of a job soon enough," Blair snapped. "Davitt will hear exactly how you undermined this investigation." He stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the whiskey bottles. The room exhaled, but no one looked at Hamish. Priscilla set down her glass. "I was trying to help," she said. Her voice carried less steel than usual. "You helped Blair more than me," Hamish said. "You gave him a crowd to humiliate me in front of." She flinched the smallest amount, a tiny tightening around her eyes, but met his gaze. "You weren't doing anything, Hamish. Someone had to." That hurt more than Blair's words, because it was near enough true. Colin drifted back, eager as a pup sniffing a bone. "You have quite the lively village," he said. "Your minister was especially interesting. He mentioned the kirk bell being tested earlier in the week. Odd hour, too. Evening, I think. Said it sounded wrong." Hamish stared at him. Tested? Aye, some small repair. Someone suggested he ring it at that hour to be sure it worked. Priscilla watched Hamish closely. That matters? Aye, Hamish said slowly. If the bell was rung at an unusual time, anyone outside that night might think they heard 9 o'clock when they didn't. Colin brightened. So the timeline is none of your concern, Hamish snapped, though the pulse of realization beat through him like a drum. Someone in the village had known exactly how to use that sound. Someone who wanted the night shifted, stretched, rearranged. Priscilla rose. Hamish! He shook his head. You've done enough. For a moment her face softened, not warmly, only tiredly. You can push everyone away if it pleases you, but the truth won't change. She left before he could answer. Colin followed, scribbling again. Hamish stayed behind, suddenly aware that the fire had burned too low, the bar too cold. Lugs pressed against his shin, warm and solid. Don't look at me like that, Hamish muttered. I ken fine I've made a mess. The dog didn't move. Outside, the lock air seeped through the cracks of the old hotel. Something in it felt shifted, as if the whole village had taken one breath too deep and couldn't let it out again. Hamish stood there a long moment, the humiliation still burning under his skin, but beneath it something colder, the sense that the bell, the clocks, the rain, none of them had been accidents. Someone had planned the night to the minute. Hamish knew at once something was wrong. The kirk door, usually stiff as an old crofter's back, swung inward too easily when he pushed it. It scraped the stone in a thin, complaining line. The sound travelled through the empty nave, and Lugs gave a low whine, the kind he made when he sensed trouble but couldn't decide from which direction it came. Quiet, Hamish muttered, though his own stomach felt much the same. He had spent the morning where he was not supposed to be, the manse office, the kirk records cupboard, Mr. Patel's back ledger drawer, and finally the electricity meter outside Rory's cottage. He had told anyone who asked that he was checking something for Strathbane, which fooled exactly no one. The villagers barely spoke to him now, except in clipped sentences, and even those were edged with resentment. It suited him. He needed the silence. The figures hadn't matched. None of them. Not the meter reading, not the bell repair log, not the postmark on the returned letter. The whole night of Rory's death had been built on a false 9 o'clock that someone had encouraged the village to remember, and that someone had been careful enough to hide behind the noise of gossip. Lugs padded down the aisle ahead of him. The dog paused halfway, sniffing, ears stiff. Hamish followed his gaze to the side pews. A man sat there, small and neat, hands folded, like a child told to wait. Mr. Fraser, the kirk treasurer. He looked as if he had been sitting there a long time, his thin shoulders bent, his tweed jacket too tidy for a day of rain. "Oh," Fraser said faintly. "Constable Macbeth, I didn't hear you." Hamish closed the kirk door behind him. It thudded harder than he intended. "Aye, well, folk often dinna hear what they don't want to." Fraser blinked quickly. A nervous habit, Hamish thought, or a calculating one. Hard to say. "Is this about the unfortunate matter? I told the Strathbane men everything." "Aye, you told them plenty," Hamish said, walking to the front pew and sitting without invitation. "But you left out the bit about ringing the bell at 9. Fraser's fingers twitched. Well, the electrician suggested it, didn't he, to test the sound. I thought it prudent." "Prudent," Hamish said the word as if tasting something sour. "Funny, because the electrician's log says the test was set for earlier in the week. But the actual ringing happened on the night Rory died. You insisted on it." Fraser's face tightened, almost petulant. It was raining. One didn't wish to stand outside at random times. Hamish leaned forward. "But you did wish the village to think 9 o'clock had passed while a good number of folk were outside. You wished them to pin their stories to that sound. 9:30, they all said afterward. 9:30, 9:30, 9:30. A miracle of unity in Loch Dhu." Lugs moved up beside Hamish's knee, not growling, only breathing hard. Fraser looked at the dog as if personally offended. People panic in investigations. They cling to what they think they know. "You gave them what to cling to," Hamish said. "You were at the hall, you managed the clock, you collected the envelopes, you moved about more than anyone else, and ye had reason." Fraser shook his head sharply. "I've served this kirk for 23 years. And borrowed from it for at least 2, Hamish said, his voice flat. Rory noticed. He was a sharp man when it came to money. Asked Patel about an old cancelled cheque you misplaced. Returned letter in the post office proves he'd written to a Glasgow firm already. He was checking up on you. Fraser's lips parted, then closed. His eyes flickered to the pulpit, as though hoping it might defend him. You went to him that night, Hamish continued. Not by the road. Too many folk watching. You used your brother's boat. Rope on the jetties worn where someone tied off in a hurry. Fresh scuff marks from a man stepping onto the stones in the rain. That proves nothing, Fraser whispered. It proves you weren't at home as you claimed. Hamish's voice stayed low, lower than Fraser's. It proves somebody visited the cottage after 9, and the electricity meter proves Rory was alive well after that, using lights, kettle, maybe to stay awake because you were talking, maybe arguing. Fraser pressed his hands together so tightly the knuckles whitened. He insulted me. He had no right to threaten the hall projects, the charity accounts, everything we'd built. Borrowed, Hamish corrected. You borrowed. Fraser looked suddenly very tired. Only to cover shortfalls. It was temporary. People would have been so unkind if they knew. Hamish gave a small, dry snort. Aye, well, villagers are always kind until money's involved. Fraser sagged. He said he'd report me, said he'd ruin the reputation of the Kirk. I only meant to make him see reason. And you reached for his throat instead. Hamish stood. Spare me a pretty story. You strangled him before he fell. Doctor saw the marks. Fraser's voice cracked. I didn't. Then he stopped, stared at the hymn board, as if hoping the numbers might save him. I pushed him. He stumbled. Hamish said nothing. The silence stretched. Lugs paced once, claws clicking on the stone, then returned to Hamish's side and sat. Finally Fraser spoke again. He wouldn't stop saying what he'd do, what he'd expose. I thought, just a moment of fear in him, and he'd back down. But then he fell, and I panicked. I'm not violent, Sergeant. I'm not wicked. But I saw how easily the night might be rearranged, how people had drifted in and out of the hall. No one knew the exact time. You made sure of that, Hamish said. Fraser stared at his own shoes. It wasn't meant to harm anyone else, only to protect the village. If Strathbane thought we were united, they'd leave quickly. And Callum? Hamish asked sharply. He confessed today. Fraser flinched as if struck. He wasn't meant to. I truly thought the wrong time would be enough to confuse them. I never told him to take the blame. But you let him. Hamish's voice was calm, almost gentle, and that seemed to wound Fraser more deeply than anger could. You let him. Fraser covered his face with his hands. It would have unravelled everything. Aye, Hamish said, it will. He walked to the door, lugs rising to follow. At the threshold, Hamish paused. Fraser sat motionless, a small man folded in on himself, surrounded by the cold stone of the Kirk he claimed to have protected. You didn't just kill Rory, Hamish said without turning. You nudged a whole village into the wrong story. Folk trusted ye to tally pennies, not minutes. But you tallied the wrong thing, Mr. Fraser. He opened the door. A gust of lock air pushed in, damp and sharp, the sort that made mistakes feel heavier. Lugs looked back once. Fraser didn't move. Outside, Hamish pulled his collar up and began the slow walk toward the station he might not have much longer. His boots sank into the wet grass, and the faint toll of some far bell, only the wind stirring the metal, echoed over the loch. Come on, boy, he said, but even to his own ears the words didn't sound sure. Hamish and Lugs, they walked